History teaches a brutal lesson that most people learn too late. Regimes do not fall when crowds gather in the streets. They fall when those at the very top quietly begin preparing an exit. Long before statues are pulled down or flags are burned, the true moment of collapse begins in private rooms where contingency plans replace confidence. This is the context in which recent reports surrounding Iran's leadership must be understood, not as sensational revelations but as a familiar historical pattern. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, authoritarian systems have always shared this reflex. When the Shah of Iran boarded a plane in 1979, it was not because the protests had suddenly become unstoppable that day. It was because the elite consensus had fractured weeks earlier. Marcos in the Philippines did not flee Manila because of a single demonstration, but because he realized that loyalty inside the system had become conditional. Yanukovych abandoned Kiev only after he understood that the security apparatus was no longer unified behind him. These moments follow a script that repeats with disturbing consistency. Once a leader begins to calculate escape routes, the psychological center of gravity shifts. Power stops flowing downward with certainty and begins leaking outward through hesitation. In Iran today, the discussion is not about whether protests exist. Protests are a constant in many societies. The real question is whether the leadership still believes the system is survivable in its current form. When rumors emerge of contingency planning, of safe havens, of assets that must remain mobile rather than fixed, analysts should not ask whether every detail is verified. They should ask why such narratives resonate at all. In authoritarian politics, perception often matters more than fact. The mere belief that a leader is thinking about departure can accelerate elite defection and public boldness. This is why Plan B politics is so dangerous. It signals doubt. It suggests that even those who built the system no longer trust its durability. At that moment, fear begins to change sides, and history shows that when fear migrates upward, collapse becomes a matter of time rather than ideology. Revolutions are often remembered as ideological explosions, but they are almost always detonated by economics. Ideas may inspire anger, yet it is daily survival that determines whether anger turns into action. In Iran's case, the critical pressure point is not abstract politics, but the lived experience of scarcity and erosion. When ordinary goods become symbols of privilege, when wages lose meaning faster than they can be earned, legitimacy begins to rot from the inside. This dynamic is not unique to Iran. It has appeared repeatedly across history, from late Soviet stagnation to the final years of Eastern European communist states. Economic stress does not automatically produce revolt, but it systematically strips regimes of their strongest defense, which is the ability to promise stability. Sanctions are often debated as if they directly cause collapse. In reality, they function more like stress tests. They expose structural weaknesses that already exist and accelerate trends that leadership can no longer control. In tightly managed systems, economic pain also carries a political message. It tells citizens that the social contract has been broken. When the state can no longer deliver basic predictability, repression becomes more expensive and less effective. Every security operation drains resources. Every subsidy delays but does not resolve the core problem. Over time, regimes face a narrowing corridor of options. They can print money and risk inflation. They can cut spending and risk unrest. Or they can borrow credibility they no longer possess. What makes Iran's situation particularly volatile is the interaction between economic pressure and generational fatigue. Younger populations are less willing to trade obedience for promises that feel permanently deferred. They are also more connected, more informed, and more skeptical of official narratives. In this environment, economic decline does not merely weaken the state. It actively empowers alternative interpretations of reality. The state may insist that conditions are manageable, but lived experience contradicts that claim every day. Once that contradiction becomes undeniable, authority begins to sound hollow. This is why economic decline often precedes political fragmentation. It erodes not just material well-being, but belief itself. And when belief collapses, even powerful security institutions find themselves enforcing a story that fewer and fewer people accept as true. In geopolitics, signals matter even when intentions remain opaque. Military logistics, transport movements, and diplomatic rhythms often communicate more through implication than declaration. Recent attention to airlift activity between Iran and Russia should be viewed through this lens of strategic ambiguity. There is a temptation to assign a single dramatic explanation to such movements, but serious analysis requires restraint. Large transport aircraft fly for many reasons, including routine cooperation, contractual obligations, or symbolic reassurance between partners. What matters is not proving one explanation beyond doubt, but understanding why ambiguity itself can be useful. Ambiguity allows actors to shape perception without committing to escalation. For allies, it signals presence and concern. For adversaries, it introduces uncertainty. For domestic audiences, it can suggest support or preparedness without admitting vulnerability. This is a classic tool in great power politics. During the Cold War, ambiguous deployments were often more effective than overt threats. They forced opponents to plan for multiple contingencies, increasing psychological and strategic costs. In the Iranian context, speculation surrounding airlifts intersects with broader anxieties about regime stability. When a system feels secure, external movements are framed as routine. When a system feels fragile, the same movements acquire symbolic weight. This is why rumors can become political actors in their own right. They circulate not because they are proven, but because they fit an emerging narrative of uncertainty. Analysts should therefore focus less on the cargo and more on the context. Why do such stories gain traction now? Why do they resonate with audiences inside and outside Iran? The answer lies in the perception that Iran's strategic environment is tightening. Regional pressures, economic constraints, and internal dissent converge to create a sense that time favors neither delay nor complacency. In such moments, ambiguity becomes a shield. It preserves flexibility while avoiding definitive commitments. Yet ambiguity has limits. It can reassure allies temporarily, but it cannot restore confidence once doubt has taken root. Over time, unresolved signals contribute to a broader atmosphere of instability. They suggest that even strategic partnerships are hedging against uncertainty, and in authoritarian systems, the perception that allies are preparing for contingencies can be as destabilizing as open hostility. One of the most persistent misconceptions in international politics is the belief that pressure must take the form of invasion or overt confrontation. In reality, modern power projection often relies on restraint rather than force. Washington's posture toward Iran illustrates this logic clearly. Despite intense rhetoric and speculation, there is little evidence of preparation for large-scale military intervention. Instead, the strategy emphasizes signaling, deterrence, and controlled escalation. This approach reflects hard lessons learned from previous conflicts where overwhelming force produced long-term instability rather than resolution. Precision capability, rather than mass deployment, has become the language of influence. The goal is not to overthrow regimes directly, but to shape their calculations. By maintaining readiness without committing to action, the United States preserves leverage while minimizing risk. This form of pressure operates in the psychological domain. It communicates that options exist without declaring when or whether they will be used. Historically, such strategies have often been more unsettling than visible mobilization. During the Cold War, moments of greatest tension were not defined by armies crossing borders, but by ambiguous signals that left adversaries guessing. In the Iranian case, restraint also serves a political function. It avoids unifying internal factions against an external enemy. Large-scale intervention would likely consolidate support for the regime, even among critics. Strategic patience, by contrast, allows internal dynamics to unfold. It places the burden of response on Tehran rather than Washington. This asymmetry is deliberate. It forces Iranian leadership to manage domestic pressures while accounting for external uncertainty. The absence of invasion plans does not indicate weakness. It reflects confidence that time and structure can achieve what force cannot. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and information exposure operate cumulatively. They erode resilience rather than provoke defiance. From a realist perspective, this approach aligns with risk management. It recognizes that the collapse of legitimacy cannot be engineered from outside, only accelerated once internal conditions are ripe. Washington's role, therefore, is less about action and more about positioning. It seeks to remain the decisive variable without becoming the central actor. In this sense, the most powerful signal is not movement, but patience. Authoritarian power ultimately rests not on weapons, but on control of narrative. This is why information has become the most contested battlefield of the modern era. When a state cuts internet access, restricts communication platforms, or criminalizes the sharing of images, it is not demonstrating confidence, it is revealing fear. Information shutdowns or emergency measures, used when persuasion has failed and legitimacy can no longer be maintained through routine messaging. In the past, regimes could isolate populations physically. Today, isolation is far more difficult to sustain. Satellite connectivity, encrypted messaging, and decentralized platforms have altered the balance irreversibly. Even brief moments of connection can fracture carefully constructed narratives. What makes this development particularly destabilizing is not the volume of information, but its emotional authenticity. Grainy videos, fragmented testimonies, and unfiltered voices often carry more credibility than official statements. They bypass institutional trust entirely and speak directly to lived experience. For authoritarian systems, this represents a structural vulnerability. Repression can silence individuals, but it struggles to erase images once they circulate. Each attempt to suppress information often amplifies its perceived importance. Citizens begin to ask why something must be hidden. That question alone erodes authority. Information warfare is therefore asymmetric. The state expends enormous effort to contain what individuals can spread at minimal cost. Over time, this imbalance exhausts the apparatus of control. It also internationalizes domestic crisis. External audiences form perceptions that shape diplomatic and economic responses. The regime loses control not only at home but abroad. Crucially, information exposure does not require coordination or leadership. It thrives precisely because it is chaotic and decentralized. No single voice must be eliminated. No headquarters can be dismantled. This is why information control fails most dramatically during periods of internal stress. The more pressure the system faces, the more brittle its narrative defenses become. In this environment, silence becomes louder than speech. Absence of information is interpreted as guilt or weakness. The regime may still command force, but it increasingly loses the ability to command belief. and once belief erodes, power begins to operate on borrowed time. One of the most dangerous assumptions in periods of upheaval is the belief that opposition automatically equals progress. History offers repeated warnings against this simplification. The collapse of an authoritarian regime does not guarantee the emergence of a liberal or democratic order. It merely creates a vacuum. What fills that vacuum depends on organization, discipline, and strategic readiness, not moral aspiration alone. Iran's own history illustrates this lesson with brutal clarity. In 1979, diverse groups united against a decaying monarchy. Yet unity against a common enemy concealed profound differences about the future. Those differences were resolved not through consensus, but through coercion by the most organized faction. This pattern has repeated across regions and ideologies. Movements with rigid internal structures, ideological absolutism, and centralized authority often outcompete more pluralistic forces during transitions. They promise order amid chaos. That promise can be seductive. It is in this context that external observers must approach armed or highly disciplined opposition groups with caution. The existence of a regime's unpopularity does not confer legitimacy on its challengers. Some groups position themselves as alternatives while replicating the same authoritarian logic they claim to oppose. They demand loyalty, suppress dissent, and justify violence as necessity. Such movements are not deviations from authoritarianism. They are continuations under a different banner. For external powers, the temptation to support any force that weakens an adversary is understandable but short-sighted. Tactical alignment often produces strategic regret. Empowering opaque actors can entrench instability rather than resolve it. From a realist perspective, the key question is not whether an opposition group opposes the regime, but whether it can sustain pluralism once power is attained. History suggests this outcome is rare. Transitions fail most often when the loudest and most organized voices crowd out broader social participation. This is why caution is essential. Revolutions can replace rulers quickly, but replacing systems is far harder. Without institutional safeguards and inclusive frameworks, power simply changes hands while its underlying logic remains intact. The danger is not chaos alone, but the consolidation of a new form of control that inherits the tools and habits of the old. Modern protest movements increasingly defy traditional models of leadership. Rather than rallying around a single figure or organization, they operate through loose networks, shared grievances, and spontaneous coordination. This shift profoundly unsettles authoritarian systems. Leader-centered opposition can be targeted, coopted, or eliminated. Leaderless movements resist such strategies by design. They have no headquarters to raid and no figurehead to discredit. Their strength lies in adaptability rather than hierarchy. Digital tools have accelerated this transformation. Information spreads horizontally rather than vertically. Mobilization occurs through imitation rather than instruction. When one group acts, others replicate the behavior independently. This creates a cascading effect that is difficult to predict and even harder to suppress. For security forces, the absence of clear command structures complicates response. There is no single trigger to pull that ends the movement. Attempts to crush one node often generate momentum elsewhere. From the perspective of the state, this uncertainty is deeply destabilizing. It erodes confidence in traditional control mechanisms. At the same time, leaderless movements carry inherent risks. They can struggle to articulate coherent demands or negotiate outcomes. Their power lies in disruption rather than governance. Yet for regimes under pressure, disruption alone can be enough. It raises costs, exposes fractures, and forces concessions. Importantly, these movements alter the psychology of participation. Individuals no longer wait for permission or instruction. They act when conditions align. This lowers the threshold for engagement. Fear dissipates gradually rather than collapsing all at once. Each act of participation normalizes the next. Authoritarian systems are built on predictability and deterrence. Leaderless movements undermine both. They introduce randomness into environments that rely on control. Even when suppressed temporarily, the underlying logic persists. The state may restore order, but it cannot easily restore certainty. From a historical perspective, this represents a structural challenge rather than a temporary disturbance. Systems designed for command and obedience struggle against dynamics rooted in spontaneity and mutual recognition. The absence of leaders does not signify weakness. In many cases, it is the source of resilience. Iran's turmoil should not be viewed in isolation. It functions as a mirror reflecting broader structural vulnerabilities shared by many centralized systems. The warning is not ideological but institutional. When legitimacy rests heavily on control rather than consent, stress accumulates quietly until release becomes inevitable. Economic pressure, information exposure, and elite uncertainty converge across different contexts with remarkable similarity. What differs is timing, not trajectory. Comparisons to other states should be approached analytically rather than rhetorically. No two systems are identical, yet structural patterns recur. Concentrated power narrows feedback loops. Leaders receive reassurance rather than truth. Decisions become reactive rather than adaptive. Over time, this creates strategic blindness. When disruption arrives, responses tend to be excessive or misdirected. This is not a moral failing but a systemic one. Centralized authority prioritizes stability over learning. It resists correction until options have narrowed. The lesson for other regimes is not that collapse is imminent. but that resilience requires openness. Systems that cannot absorb criticism peacefully often confront it violently later. History demonstrates that repression can delay change but rarely eliminates it. Each delay increases eventual cost. The most enduring forms of stability emerge not from fear, but from legitimacy that adapts to evolving expectations. From a realist standpoint, this is a matter of self-interest rather than idealism. States that adjust incrementally avoid catastrophic transitions, those that do not gamble on permanence. Iran's experience underscores the risks of that gamble. It shows how quickly confidence can erode once belief weakens. It also reveals the limits of external support. Allies may hedge, partners may signal, but no external actor can substitute for domestic legitimacy. Ultimately, power that relies exclusively on enforcement becomes fragile under sustained pressure. The future remains unwritten. Outcomes are contingent, not predetermined. Yet the structural warning is clear. Systems that ignore accumulated stress invite abrupt reckoning. Those that recognize it early preserve agency. History does not punish power for being strong. It punishes it for being inflexible.